Well, since it's March Madness, I wanted to create a video explaining kind of how to do and maybe some advice on how to do some sports photography. It's very popular. You know, you could do it with the cell phone, you could do it with the DSLR, mirrorless. There's all kinds of tools out there that people use to take pictures of, whether it be they go to a college event, you know, they happen to be at a pro event, or if they also are shooting their kids, which is actually an incredibly important thing for most people to do. A lot of these events, they have photographers that go to them that maybe will share those photos. But even then, you know, if you're that person who's going there and people are depending on you to actually shoot and capture for them, there's some kind of tips and some kind of rules you have to follow depending on what kind of sport it is. Back in the day, you know, 15, 20 years ago, it wasn't abnormal for people to actually use a flash to try to get pictures of these things, especially if you're shooting like younger kid sports, you know, all the way down to like the pee-wee age, all the way up through middle school, all the way up into high school. Various places have different quality of lights. Some lights are incredibly bright. Some actually probably compete with some colleges. Some of them are actually incredibly dim, and cameras just were not designed to really handle low light very well, especially when digital first started to find its way onto the scene. Film was a lot different. Film, you just got the ISO, the ASA rated film that you need to be able to shoot. But with digital, it came down to the quality of the sensor and also what your camera could possibly do and with the lenses that you could possibly put on it. So it still follows the same guidelines, it still follows the same rules and everything the film had to do. But the technology was one of those things where you either spent this much on this or you spend an insane amount to be able to get a camera that can handle low light pretty well. But now, thankfully, in the last 5 to 10 years, cameras started to become a lot more equipped with being able to do this naturally without having to break the bank, to be honest. So the first thing you want to do when you go and you shoot sports is you really need to know how far away you're going to be. If you're going to be up close, you're going to have to know what kind of lens you're going to need. You're going to need to know, okay, can I get a wider angle if they come closer to me? Or if they happen to run away, can I still reach them with where I am? And then kind of wanting to decide what kind of photography you want to do, what your style is going to be. Maybe you want a more wide angle of stuff. You want to tell more of a story. Maybe you're not just trying to focus on individual people. So, you don't necessarily need a strong telephoto to do something like that. If you're shooting football, you need a little bit of telephoto because usually the action is happening many yards away, sometimes even up to 100 yards away if you're at the other end or if they are playing on the other side of the field at that time. And to get those tighter shots, you definitely need a telephoto. You can shoot, you can crop, but you're still going to lose some of that detail that you would have otherwise had if you were able to kind of reach it naturally with your camera and your lens. Maybe you're shooting basketball. You're underneath the goal, or maybe you're down there in the corner of the sidelines, and there's a lot of actions that's happening right there next to you. If you're shooting with a 70 to 200, for example, that's going to be awfully tight. You're going to be focusing on expressions. You're not going to get to see a lot of the action that's happening around you. Now, if you like to film defense from the other side of the court for the team that you're trying to follow, then stay down there where they're actually scoring, and then just shoot across there, and that's where a 70 to 200 could come in handy. Maybe even a 300 or a 400 could come in handy in that situation. High school basketball, if I remember correctly, the courts are, I think, 84 feet long, somewhere around there. For college and pro, the courts are 94 feet long. So that's a pretty long distance to try to take pictures of people from across the way. Now, when they come down onto the end that you're working, well, at that point, your telephoto is not going to be super helpful because you're really just going to be focusing on the people themselves. And it's quite often one of those things. You go, you show up, and you take some pictures. You kind of see what worked, what didn't work, and the next time you go and you try something else. I personally like to shoot a little bit more wide angle, not overly wide, not journalistic style, but I do like to do it in a way that you can see the action that's going on. Someone going up for a dunk, just getting a picture of them doing that, that's great. You can see cool reaction. You see the ball going through the net. That's fantastic. But you could do that in a dunk contest. You could do that, just have them go and dunk anytime without anybody around, and you can still tell that same story. It's not helping tell what's going on in the game. And that's where I like to actually shoot a little bit wider so that I can actually see, a few other players and see the reactions and see really my goal, and I think this is a goal for most photographers who shoot journalism, is whatever you can tell in the story just from the photo itself. You're still going to have the article, you're still going to have the cut lines, the captions, but if you can tell a story with the photo, then I think you accomplished the purpose of photography, to be honest. Anybody can take a picture. Anybody can use a cell phone. Anybody can snap anything. But to really just nail it home, it really comes down to how you're going to compose the shot. And that also very heavily weighs in on what lens choice you're going to have for that day. So I like to shoot a little bit wider. I'm willing to forego the distance shots if I have to, because that's just the type I like to shoot. Now I can show up with multiple cameras. I can show up with multiple lenses, take them off, change them, do that constantly, or pull the other camera and do that. And that's very popular for journalism. I don't do that because what I'm shooting at a high school level or college level, the demand isn't really necessarily there for me to be prepared to get the absolute every shot, because it also comes down to what your experience is going to be. If you know the game that you're shooting, whether it be baseball, basketball, volleyball, golf, doesn't matter what it is. If you know the sport fairly well, you know the shots that you're going to be able to get, and you're going to know how to get those shots. You can anticipate them. Like you see someone out of the three-point line, you see a hole kind of opening up, you see them starting to do some dribble. I mean, you really know that they're going to try to drive the lane. Then you prepare it and you get in position and you have that shot. Same thing with baseball. You can watch how often the pitcher's looking at the guy on second base to see if he's going to try a pickoff move, or if the second base runner is going to try to steal third. I mean, there's a lot of things you can anticipate if you know the sport that you're actually going to be shooting. Same thing with football. If you see a play action and you see him rolling out, you probably know where the receiver is going to be. There's a lot of that kind of stuff, and that it's just kind of being present, knowing what you're doing. Bowling, it's a little bit more limited. Everybody does basically the same thing, the way they roll it down the lane, but the reactions are what's gold, And so sometimes when you frame that, you kind of want to make sure you get that pose and you get those kind of shots, which I usually consider those kind of safe shots. You get the shot as early as you can that you know is good enough to publish, and then you focus on getting the extraordinary shots, because that's just kind of how journalism happens. You don't know what's awaiting you when you get there. You don't know if there's going to be an injury. You don't know if the game's going to get called. You don't know if there's going to be, a brawl. You don't know any of that stuff going into the game. So you always want to get the safe shot, so you can have one. You can send it to the publisher, and they can at least get that presented to everybody. But then trying to, anticipate and be like, okay, this player here is he's just killing it tonight. So I want to position myself to make sure he always dribbles with his left hand. He's going to try to drive the basket with his left hand frequently. So just kind of knowing where all that kind of stuff is going on. Same thing with volleyball. You know who's going to be the setters, who's going to be the spikers. Get those people who are, the jump serves. You can watch it for all of 5 minutes and know whose role is what in most every sport, to be honest. So that's kind of what you want to do. You kind of want to go there. You want to know what your angles are. You want to know what coverage you possibly have. And you also want to know what you're trying to tell with your photography. Okay, if you're just there to shoot individual kids because you're trying to make mom and dad happy, then use your telephoto lens and just focus on those kids and take those. Because mom and dad doesn't necessarily want to see a picture of their kid with 12 other kids. But if mom and dad likes journalism style photography and they like how it just tells a story and it's just this sense of size, then that's where you're going to want to be prepared to be able to also include other people into it while still hitting your focus point, because that's still very important. When you have 12 people running across your frame and you're not tracking into them, or you have your focus point set wrong, well, you may have the wrong person in focus. Telephoto helps eliminate that because you only have a couple people in your frame, and so chances are they're right next to each other as well, and that's how you're going to be focusing pretty much the entire time you're going to be shooting that. So some other tools I would definitely recommend with sports photography. Settings are essential. Okay, I can't even emphasize that enough, because even though you see someone running across the court and you're panning, you're taking a picture, you're probably thinking, oh, they're not running that fast. Oh my gosh, 200th of a second. That's insanely fast. I mean, you consider the human eye blinks about 1/3 of a second. That is way faster than the human eye can see. So people will rely on that and they'll shoot. They'll allow their camera to be set on auto and they'll be shooting at 100 to 200, maybe 250th of a second. And believe it or not, people move a lot in that amount of time. And it doesn't necessarily have to be that they're running. You know, they could be moving their arms around. You know, they do that. And, well, that motion like that is going to be a lot faster than technically what they can actually run. So that's going to be blurry while maybe you did freeze them. Now, I will tell you this. Sometimes you want that blur. Let's say, for example, you're shooting a running event or a racing event of some kind, and you're panning with them. Well, you want them to be in focus. You want them to come out crisp, but maybe you want that background to have some motion to it. So shooting with a slower shutter at that point actually does make sense. Still takes a lot of skill to be able to do it, and you don't want to overdo it, because the longer you leave that shutter open, the more you're allowing yourself to be off center, and you're going to create some of the extra blur, and you're also going to allow that person, whoever you're trying to track, to move their head and everything, and that's going to get rid of that crispness. So if you're just wanting to get their face and you want to do it, you still want to shoot, you know, relatively quick, but slow enough that you can get some of that blur. If you're shooting basketball, you're shooting football, a lot of the times you're not wanting that blur. You're really actually wanting to just stop the action where it is, because you're trying to focus on exactly what is happening in that shot. And so to do that, you have to shoot at a relatively fast speed. If you can shoot at least 2,000th of a second, you're usually pretty safe with every human sport, okay, that doesn't involve a car. Cars go pretty fast. If you're shooting a NASCAR race, going 150, 200 miles an hour actually moves quite a bit in 1/2000th of a second. If I remember correctly of the math, 1/8000th of a second at 200 miles an hour, a car will still move almost half an inch. So, and half an inch is enough to still make something slightly blurry the closer you are to it, the more zoomed in you are. So if you want to stop that, you got to make sure you kind of pan with the car a little bit, and that will freeze the car almost perfectly. So that comes with a little bit of experience. Now, if you're far enough away, you don't notice that blur, but if you're trying to shoot a tight shot to get something on that car, you're definitely going to notice that blur when it's driving really fast right by you. Humans don't go anywhere near that fast, so 2,000th of a second is usually plenty to stop all motion of a person. Some people can exceed that, but most people will not. Now, if you're shooting inside of a basketball arena and it's high school, for example, you're probably not going to have enough light to be able to shoot at 1/2000th of a second without cranking your ISO up to an insane amount. So much that you might not even have any details left. So you probably don't want to do that. So a lot of times you can go down to 320th of a second. You can go 500th of a second. You can do 1,000th of a second when you're shooting some indoor sports, because they don't usually get up to the 20-mile-an-hour speeds that some humans can run in professional sports. Okay, they just don't have the time to do it, and there's usually an obstacle somehow in their way. Plus, they're going to have to come to a stop relatively quick, so they're not going to crank it up that fast. But you still are going to risk blur if you do shoot too slow. Now, if you just have somebody just sitting there just doing some moves with the ball, then they're just sitting there doing some fancy work, 1/300th of a second is going to be plenty fast for most of that. The part that's going to come into being a problem that maybe you won't like, though, is the ball as it's going down and they're dribbling it. Maybe that's going to have a little bit of blur. But at the same time, maybe that's the effect you want. Maybe you want to show kind of that, like the ball still moving, but humans all come to a stop. Kind of creates a little bit of like poetic art with that. So think about what it is you're wanting to do, and you could definitely go with it. I'm just telling you, you got to be careful with how you do that, because also with shutter speeds, you become a factor. I know it seems like when you hold a camera and you just hold it still, you feel like you're probably not moving whatsoever. You think, oh, I just take a picture. This isn't going to be blurry whatsoever. But actually, you're breathing. You know, your body's naturally kind of moving, kind of swaying a little bit like that. We're not statues. We're not robots. So we do have motion. So a lot of the times, it's not necessarily that, you know, the camera didn't get it. It's because, you were slightly moving because you're at the source. If you swivel up and down, that's going to be a lot more drastic than if something else goes up and down in the distance. So be really careful with that. A rule of thumb for shooting almost all things with the telephoto is shoot at least twice the focal length. And what that is let's say you have a 200 millimeter, you want to shoot at 1/400th of a second. Okay? If you have a 100 millimeter, you want to shoot at least 1/200th of a second. And now that's not a guarantee. You can still move a lot in that amount of time and still kind of ruin the shot, but that's kind of the general average for what they recommend you try to do. Now, some people, they can hold it still very well, especially if you're going to do burst shooting. We're just going to just take a bunch of pictures. You have a great chance of actually having at least one of those come out to where you weren't moving at all. But you do risk the other shots in there that you may have wanted to get instead. Image stabilizer. Different companies call it different things. Some type of image stabilization is fantastic. It's really fantastic if you're shooting, just outside landscapes, if you're shooting people, if you're doing portraits, if you're doing those types of things. When it comes to sports, it actually could be your absolute worst nightmare. Now, you can turn it off, and that's my recommendation to a lot of people. Just simply turn it off and don't use it. But there's also sometimes modes on those that allows it to only do image stabilization on one axis, which means if someone's running left and right and you don't have any reason to go up and down with the camera, you can set it to a certain mode where it'll only stabilize up and down, but then allow you to have free reign going left and right. And the reason why you don't want to have image stabilization is because it is designed to literally just stop you from moving. Okay, it is designed to compensate for the natural motion that is human beings holding these cameras. And so when you're panning with that, it's thinking, wait, you don't really want to do this. So it tries to compensate and tries to focus on something that actually is no longer there. And so your pictures can come out quite blurry. So when I shoot basketball, if I shoot football, it doesn't matter what it is, I usually will actually turn off all image stabilization. Because if I still need a little bit of stabilization, I will use what's called a monopod. If I don't have a monopod, I'll use a tripod to turn it into a monopod by only raising or lowering one of the legs. Or I just hold the camera and close my body for this extra point of contact against my chest, and then I'll try to be stable doing that. But most times, I would rather err on the side of having a photo too dark or too grainy from too much noise with a high ISO than to assume that I'm going to be perfectly still, because there's so many times you're going to get back and you're going to be super disappointed when you thought you got it, because you look at the view, you look at the preview screen on the back of these cameras and you think, oh my God, I got the shot. That's the shot right there. That's amazing. You're looking at that on a 3-inch screen. 3 inches is nothing like when you actually look on your computer screen, which is probably 21 to 27 or even larger. And then you get on there and it's like, wow, that is totally blurry. And so trusting the preview on the back is not something you really want to get in the habit of. You can trust it if you're going to take the time to zoom in and see how it looks or something like that. Or you're looking at it just to kind of make sure, okay, the eyes were open, or this is the action that happened and those types of things. The preview is actually amazing for a lot of that, especially paid work that you don't get a chance to go back out and do again. But when it comes to sports, if you're just going to flip through those really quick, you're going to be very disappointed when something actually looks like it's amazing right there, and then you get it on a computer, it's actually going to be really, really out of focus or blurry because there's just too much motion. So a monopod is a great thing to do. Monopod was kind of the way that people originally had to do it. It's just a one-legged tripod, so to speak, which I know in itself contradicts itself, but very small, convenient. You can put it, in your backpack. You can carry it. It doesn't weigh anything, and it allows you to have that extra point of contact with the earth. So the camera, is not going to move up and down in that situation, and you're still free to go left and right and kind of swivel it. And taking off all that weight out of your hands, you don't have any muscle fatigue that you're going to get just by simply holding the camera for an extended period of time. So that's my advice. I mean, there's a lot of different ways you can shoot sports. There's a lot of different ways you can kind of practice it. If you're going to go shoot high school sports, go watch some younger kids sports. Even if you have no vested interest in any of those, go there, practice shooting and doing those types of things, and go to the high school stuff and kind of hammer it out a little more. And if you go to college, which means you probably got a press pass, you're probably going to have a little bit more experience already at that point, so you're probably not going to be second guessing your game. But the more experience you can get, the more practice you can get, the better you're going to be at doing it. But really, the secret, I think, to sports is to know the sport and know how to anticipate what's going to happen in it. So if you have any questions, you have any comments or anything, you want any more advice, definitely feel free to let me know. I'll be more than happy to try to help you out. But other than that, have a great time shooting, and I'll see you in the next video.